Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you're well, and that you're not eating. Like, seriously, if you're eating, pause this video and come back later, because things are about to get really uncomfortable really quick.
Well, with editing like that, I'm already uncomfortable, but you know what? I dig it. Let's go.
You've been warned.
Show me the evidence, show me the evidence. 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 Show me the evidence, show me the evidence.
Okay, I definitely approve of this. Well played. If the critique that follows is going to be half as good as this edit, then, well, I'm about to get spanked. Anyhow, for a bit of context, a few days ago, the YouTube channel Islamic Calling published a video titled Rationality Rules Debunked on the Problem of Evil, and I thought it'd be fun to give him a response.
So I haven't made a video on Stephen in a while now, so I figured, you know what, let's make another video on him, and let's see what he's been up to. And it turns out he's making videos on worms.
Worms? Bro, that's not a nice thing to call apologists.
So recently he made a video on Jordan Peterson, where Jordan Peterson had a conversation with Stephen Fry. Yeah, that's Stephen Fry.
Oh, you mean parasites? Yeah, okay, well, now we're on the same page.
Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us?
Yeah, it was a video pertaining to the problem of evil. More precisely, the problem of gratuitous evil being incompatible with an all-powerful, all-knowing and all-loving God.
So let's take a look and see what he says.
Conculiasis, which is derived from the Latin affliction with little dragons, is a parasitic infection caused by the guinea worm. A person becomes infected by drinking water that contains microcrustaceans infected with guinea worm larvae. And once one's stomach acid dissolves the crustaceans, the larvae then penetrate your digestive tract, escaping into your body, where over the following year, they grow up to 80 centimeters or 31 inches in length. The worms then mate, with the males dying shortly after, but the females eventually migrate to your subcutaneous tissue, where they cause an extremely painful blister to erupt that compels you to submerge the wound in water. Then, over several days or weeks, the worm slowly emerges from the laceration and expels thousands of larvae into the water, which in turn infects crustaceans, thus continuing the so-called beautiful circle of life. Now, if there is a God, and he is, as theists tend to insist, all-powerful and all-loving, then for what possible mysterious reason did he create these disgusting fiery serpents, as they've been referred to in scripture?
Okay, so this is something the atheists always do.
Well, hold up. Since Islamic Calling is about to offer a critique, let me recap the relevant point I made shortly after he paused it. The reason I brought up draconculiasis was to illustrate just one of many species whose life cycle necessitates inflicting great suffering on other sentient beings. Such parasites are, or can be argued to be, an example of gratuitous evil, that is, evil that exists without justification, and gratuitous evil is incompatible with an omnipotent, omniscient and omnibenevolent God. Why? Because such a God has the means, opportunity and desire to prevent gratuitous evil, and yet gratuitous evil exists.
Okay, so this is something the atheists always do. So you will notice that atheists, whenever they make this type of argument from evil type arguments, they always use the most extreme examples. So basically here he is committing the appeal to extreme fallacy. So in case you guys don't know, appeal to extreme fallacy is a fallacy where you use the most extreme example as the norm, when in reality it's not the norm, right?
Let's bring up the appeal to extreme fallacy for longer than a second, as that way we'll be able to actually read it. Description: erroneously attempting to make a reasonable argument into an absurd one, by taking the argument to the extremes. Logical form: if X is true, then Y must also be true, where Y is the extreme of X. And then the author, Bo Bennett, gives us an example. There is no way those Girl Scouts could have sold all those cases of cookies in 1 hour. If they did, they would have to make $500 in 1 hour, which, based on an 8-hour day, is over $1 million a year. This line of reasoning attempts to dismiss that the Girl Scouts made $500 in an hour by appealing to the extreme. It states that if X is true, that is, if the Girl Scouts made $500 in an hour, then Y is also true. That is, the Girl Scouts are among the highest paid people in the world. The problem, of course, is that Y doesn't follow from X, since it assumes many additional things, including that the Girl Scouts work 40 hours in a week and that there is only one Girl Scout in Girl Scouts, as opposed to a team. But with this fallacy in mind, let's see how Islamic calling bolsters his accusation against me and the problem of evil.
So here he's using this example of this disease, of this parasitic disease, where people get infected by this disease and this worm slowly comes out of the body. So when you hear about it, obviously it sounds very disgusting, right? But the thing is that this disease is actually very uncommon. It's rare. But he's using this type of like extreme cases to show, look how bad things are in nature, right? And completely ignoring all the other like normal things that exist in nature.
No, that's not what I was expressing, and nor was it what Stephen Fry, David Hume or Epicurus expressed. To follow as close as possible the logical form of the appeal to extreme fallacy, what I was arguing was, if X is true, that is, if God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent and omniscient, then Y is also true, that is, gratuitous evil doesn't exist. And I was referencing draconculiasis as an example of gratuitous evil. Crucially, this isn't an appeal to the extreme. Crippling parasites, cancer in children, and forest fires are not extreme versions of God's supposed attributes. No, they are contradictions of what God's supposed attributes entail. So the accusation of me appealing to the extreme here is just completely off base. It's just not accurate.
Imagine if I said this, right? Imagine if I said that atheists are all bad people, and I used like Pol Pot as an example. Now, obviously, that's ridiculous, because Pol Pot is like the most extreme example of an atheist, right?
No, not right. And talking of fallacies, this is an association fallacy. It's no better than arguing that Pol Pot is an extreme example of someone with short hair. The extreme version of someone with short hair is not someone who starves millions, and the extreme version of someone who's not convinced that God exists is also not someone who starves millions.
And that's the problem here, right? Appeal to extreme fallacy is usually fallacious because these type of extreme examples are the exception, they're not the rule. So you cannot use the exception as the rule.
Yeah, we can't treat exceptions as if they're the norm. But fortunately, that's not what the argument does. It doesn't treat gratuitous evil as if it's the norm. It simply claims that gratuitous evil exists, or assumes it for the sake of argument, while emphasizing that gratuitous evil is not compatible with the triomni God. Now, what normally happens in the dialectical is that theists employ a theodicy to account for gratuitous evil, such as the greater good theodicy, which argues that gratuitous evil doesn't actually exist, since everything is for the greater good.
How can this be for the greater good? Shut it!
Or, and here's my favourite, theists can simply drop one of the omni attributes. For instance, God being all-loving. Many Muslims in fact do precisely this, and in doing so they nullify the argument. It's just not a problem for them. If God isn't all-loving, then him creating parasites that inflict untold suffering on his favourite mammal just isn't a contradiction. Nor is him burning to death millions of sentient beings in forest fires. It's perfectly halal. However, as William Lane Craig, among many others, have argued, this renders the God of Islam not to be the greatest conceivable being, since an all-loving God is greater than a God who is not all-loving. Or in other words, a God who inflicts gratuitous cancer on children is, surely, not the most merciful.
But Allah is so merciful, man. Is he though?
But back to the accusation of appealing to the extreme, the problem of evil, be it presented in a logical or evidential form, doesn't attempt to make a reasonable argument into an absurd one, chiefly because they aren't addressing an argument at all. Rather, they are arguments. Further still, both lines of argument don't treat extreme states as if they are the norm. Islamic calling is just mistaken on this accusation.
These type of extreme examples are the exception, they're not the rule.
It doesn't matter if they're not the norm. If any gratuitous evil whatsoever exists, then the triomni God doesn't exist. The two states are mutually exclusive. And forest fires, especially those that occurred long before the dawn of humans, are evidently instances of gratuitous evil.
So according to World Health Organization, they said the following: dracunculiasis is a crippling parasitic disease on the verge of eradication, with 27 human cases reported in 2020. So here you can clearly see that there are only like 27 people that are affected with this.
Yeah, that's 27 cases of gratuitous evil too many. We only need one. That's the point of the argument.
And he's using this as an example. Oh, look how bad nature is, right? Because he's trying to make it seem like God is evil.
No, the argument does not try to make out that God is evil. It simply asks theists to account for gratuitous evil, to explain how, if at all, God's omni-attributes is compatible with gratuitous evil. To think that the argument attempts to make God look evil is to fundamentally misunderstand the point.
Now, as for why these type of diseases exist, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually answers this question in the Quran itself. For example, he says, do the people think that they will be left to say we believe and they will not be tried? You can read about this in Quran 29:2. For example, in another verse, it says the following, and we will surely let them taste the nearer punishment, short of the greater punishment, that perhaps they will return. You can read about this in Quran 32:21. Now, if you read the tafsir of this verse, it says, Ibn Kathir actually breaks this down, and he says that basically the reason why trials and tribulations exist is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to test us, right? He has put us on earth to test us. So earth is not supposed to be some kind of paradise. You're supposed to go through trials and tribulation. That's one of the main purposes why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put us here, right?
Okay, so you're claiming that gratuitous evil exists because Allah wants to test us. That is, Allah permits evil not because it's necessary to achieve a greater good or prevent an equally bad situation, but rather and simply because it tests us. Thus, you're dropping the omnibenevolent claim, and with it the notion of Allah being all-merciful.
The reason why trials and tribulations exist is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to test us, right? He has put us on earth to test us.
So, according to Islamic calling, Allah deliberately composed numerous mass extinctions before the dawn of humankind, in which billions of animals suffered to test us. He created parasites, nickelback, and famine to entice people to 1. Somehow figure out that he exists, and 2. Convince us to sufficiently grovel at his feet. Okay, quick question. Are you sure your God is all-merciful?
But Allah is so merciful, man. Is he though?
And the reason he sends these type of trials and tribulation is to see if we're actually sincere or not. Whether we turn towards him or if we move away from him, right?
And here we go. Islamic calling is coupling being sincere
or not
with being convinced of Islam.
Whether we turn towards him or if we move away from him, right?
But they're not synonymous, and this is a major problem for many theists. The majority of theists just can't admit that there's room for rational disagreement. It can't be that atheists have earnestly and sincerely considered the case for God and come out as an atheist, despite the fact that most of the world's leading philosophers have done precisely this. No, theists insist upon defining atheists as bad, insincere people, deserving of eternal damnation. Anyhow, from here, Islamic calling moves his attention to zakat, one of the pillars of Islam.
The reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends this type of trials and tribulation is to test us, right? And part of that test is to see whether we do the right thing, whether we give charity, whether we turn towards him in obedience, right?
And here we go again. Islamic calling is conflating giving to charity,
whether we give charity,
and turning to Allah,
whether we turn towards him.
And the problem, again, is that there exists plenty of people who regularly give to charity, and yet they're wholeheartedly and sincerely not convinced that Allah exists. In fact, most sincere and charitable people fall into this bracket. And what's their reward? How does Allah repay them? Well, unless Muslims want to make the controversial claim that non-Muslims can make it to Jannah, then most decent, sincere, charitable people are bound for Jahannam.
But Allah is so merciful, man.
Shut it!
Or to approach this view from another angle, if a parent deliberately sets up a room for their children, saturates it with disease and only supplies some of the children with adequate sustenance some of the time, most people, arguably all, would find this to be anything but merciful. But when Allah does the same to billions of his children, Muslims drop to their knees in praise. Personally, I think it's more likely that if Allah exists and is testing our moral character at all, he's interested in seeing who has compassionate conviction. In a geniusly ironic twist, the holy books might themselves be the test in disguise, a test of whether we can figure out that might doesn't make right.
And when we give charity and when we turn towards him in obedience, this automatically reduces suffering. Because if you give charity to people, then they can use that money to, get better medicine, get better healthcare, right? And this way, you can fight things like this type of disgusting diseases, right? So in a way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually makes sure that we as human beings can become better people.
But this is Allah you're talking about, the Almighty, the All-Merciful. And so, for what possible reason do you limit his powers? Why couldn't he have created humans so that we can develop without experiencing such suffering? Was giving children leukemia really the only way of getting people to donate? Was causing multiple mass extinctions really the only way to get us to turn to him? This doesn't make sense at all. Honestly, this is just such a mess, and it requires you to commit yourself to all sorts of improbable propositions, all while confidently assuming that those that are not convinced by these propositions are deserving of eternal damnation.
This is actually quite beautiful.
To recap, then, if you deal with the problem of evil by asserting that gratuitous evil exists simply to test us, then you're dropping the omnibenevolent claim, and the problem of evil just ain't a problem for you. However, and this relates to Islamic calling accusing me of trying to portray God as evil,
Because he's trying to make it seem like God is evil.
it's not the problem of evil that makes Allah appear evil, but rather your answer to the problem of evil that entails Allah being evil. If Allah didn't create evil to achieve a greater good, but rather and merely he created it to test whether we become convinced of a set of very improbable propositions, then, at the very least, he's anything but merciful.
But Allah is so merciful.
Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and YouTube members. Your support is truly and sincerely for the greater good. Thank you.